This is the end of history.
A true revolution of values will soon cause us to question the fairness and justice of many of our past and present policies.
We believe that peace is at hand.
An axis of evil arming to threaten the peace of the world.
Democracy and freedom for all. We must choose in this crucial moment of human history.
Hey folks, I'm JB Shreve, and this is the End of History podcast, and we're looking today at the start of a brand new podcast series being released here at theendofhistory.net. It's called The Empire, a 250-year American story. Now, as most of you know, whenever I begin a new series like this, a new podcast series, I like to post an intro episode that kind of outlines the objectives, the expectations for what lies ahead, and that's what this episode right here is. So we're going to cover all of that here in just a second. In the meantime, you can also check out the very first episodes in this new series wherever you download or stream your favorite podcasts, as well as on YouTube. All right? So for many years, probably since this podcast first began dropping episodes, really, way back in 2012, I've wanted to do a series on the history of America. And I even knew what the title would be. It would have something to do with the empire. All right? So it's very easy for us to think that the times we live in, that they're normal. We become accustomed to the news cycles, the shocks, the outrage, the distractions, and so forth. And we miss the glaring reality that all of this is anything but normal. And I tend to think that those who have traveled internationally, particularly if you traveled in your younger formative years, you probably see America differently. You've seen that life is not like it is here, everywhere else. It's easier for you to understand, I think it's easier for you to understand that what we're experiencing, what we've been experiencing for the past 15 to 20 years is certainly not normal. And for a time, I kind of thought what we're going to be doing in this series, I thought it would be a book series. But then I eventually decided I didn't want to go that route, so I wanted to do a podcast series. And when I realized a little over a year ago that the 250th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence, of America's independence, is set for 2026 this year, it just seemed too perfect to miss, right? It's too perfect not to miss, or to miss, however you say that. Earlier this spring, I was able to attend an art exhibit that looked at the 250th anniversary of America. And I think as we approach Independence Day this summer, you'll hear more and more rah-rah type of stuff about the 250th anniversary of the nation. Anyway, this art exhibit had a lot of cool stuff. I saw some of the early paintings of George Washington, an original copy of Thomas Paine's Common Sense, really interesting painting of Thomas Jefferson with Sally Heming hidden in the background, right? And it all tracked all the way up to the present. And there was an exhibit for the 100th anniversary of the country, way back in 1876. Back then they set up this big exhibit where different buildings proudly represented the different states of the young nation at that time. There were celebrations of the recent emancipation of the slaves, which had just happened a little more than 10 years before that, right? This was back in the middle of the Gilded Age, 1876, just a decade or so after the Civil War. And then this exhibit that I was visiting, it went all the way to the present. And I found it really interesting as the journey through this art exhibit arrived at the present day. There was such a sense of anxiety and fear dominated in the present day exhibits, particularly in contrast to the pride, the progress that was celebrated in earlier phases of the country's history. In one exhibit, one of the modern exhibits, the audience was invited to leave messages. And those messages for the future, right? Those messages actually became incorporated into one of the final art pieces itself. And they were all fearful of what the future holds, fearful of what is happening in the present, fearful of what's being lost or what might be being lost. Now, I found that pretty fascinating. And I want to track, in this series, how we got from an era of revolution, of progress, of hope, of ambition, to this pervading sense of concern that many out there, many of us, feel today. Even if you feel your politics are winning today, that sense of victory is often nestled in a well of insecurity. If I don't hold on to this, someone will come and take it from me. So this is it. Starting with this episode and the next episode in the series, which we'll post about 5 minutes after this one, we're going to go through the story of the American Empire, the empire's rise, and, well, whatever is happening right now, all the way up to the present, okay? And as you all know, I love history. I have ever since I was a kid. American history particularly was one of my first passions. When we were young, my family did a lot of traveling. And I don't know if these are still out there, but at that time, this would have been around the late 1980s, there were these booklets on tables at restaurants, in different restaurants, particularly in the western U.S. I figure it was probably associated with the Mormons, but I don't know that for sure, to be honest. It was just a little booklets of American historical facts and anecdotes, little stories of our story along the way. And I used to love those things. I'm actually kind of curious if any of the listeners remember those booklets from out in the American West that were real big in the early 90s, late 80s. If you've seen any of those, let me know where they came from. Let me know if they still even exist out there. Shoot me an email. Those little booklets were like a gateway drug for an interest in American history for me at that age. And in the last couple of decades, the story of American history has become really, like everything else. It's very politicized, very polarized. Now, part of that's normal. National history is always political. The old saying goes, the victors write the history. And so that means the losers of the big battles or the genocides or whatever, they don't get their voices heard, their stories heard. But we kind of passed the mark of what's normal when it comes to politicized history and really took it to a new level in recent years. Maybe you've heard of the 1619 Project. It began in 2019, the 400th anniversary of the first slaves being brought over to the United States. It wasn't the U.S. at that time, but the colonies at that time, the New World at that time. This group, the 1619 Project, they told the story of American history as something that was all about oppression, all about injustice. It was built on the backs of enslaved Africans and African Americans. Well, to counter the influence of that narrative, and what was seen as a woke, I'm saying woke with quotation marks around it, a woke agenda, we now have the 1776 Project. And this was a byproduct of the Make America Great Again crowd and the MAGA crowd, aimed at countering the woke narratives and focused on a patriotic story of American history. It's kind of a mark of our own age that everyone has their own version of American history, what it is, what it isn't, their own agenda. And the thing is, as a Christian in America, we already know this game. When I was coming of age, American Christians were fighting for their own version of American history that defined the story as a uniquely American story. In the 1980s, early 1990s, the American religious right was swinging back against the new left liberals of the 1960s and 70s and a cycle of narratives that had been in place at that point. Now, the 60s and 70s, the new left liberals, they weren't the first, but they were probably the most radical historical revisionists up to that point in time. And they told the story of American history as a story of oppression, as a story of power, old rich white men ruling the world and dominating black people, American Indians, women, and all for the sake of capitalist interest. It was a powerful medium for this. It wasn't just books, but also Hollywood and the movies that retold American history. Now, you go look at the historical biopics of like the biopic movies of the 1960s and 70s. Compare that to what was out there in the 1950s. It's like the story of the history of two different nations being told when you look at it from that perspective. But at the time, when I was coming of age in the 80s and 90s, the Christian right was on the upswing. They were retelling the story of American history on its own terms. In the Christian elementary school I went to, I learned all about how Christopher Columbus was a devoted Christian who believed he was called by God to discover the New World. William Penn, Robert E. Lee, Abraham Lincoln, Paul Revere, the stories of America were the stories of great Christian men and women. That's what I was taught as a young kid. And when I was a young guy, my mom, seeing my interest in history, she gave me two key books on American Christian history, The Light and the Glory and From Sea to Shining Sea. Now, these were written by Peter Marshall. He was a prominent minister and a Christian historian from the 1950s all the way up until his death in the 70s. And I still recommend those books, to be honest with you. For anyone interested in reading about America's Christian history, I recommend those. They're still on my bookshelves, in fact, here in the study where I'm recording this episode. But Peter Marshall and many of his contemporaries who explored and tried to regain the narrative of America's Christian history, they debunked a lot of the myths that had come to dominate the story of America's history in the 1960s, the 1970s. The Puritans weren't wackos, they said. They were men and women living under conviction and a sense of calling. The Salem witch trials may seem extreme from our retrospective perspectives 300 years later, but they were pretty normal for the time. I mean, they kind of mimicked things that were going on in Europe at that same time period. And I remember even some key documentaries from my formative years that explored how America's education system and social systems began disintegrating, specifically when prayer was removed from America's public schools in the early 1960s. These were influential arguments at that time. But as I continued to read, as I continued to study history on my own, I realized that school integration also happened around that same time period. So did that mean that the end of segregation also contributed to the decline of public schools and America's social system? This was a sincere and an instinctual critical perspective which my parents built into me as I studied, and it gave me pause and made me question the difference between causal relationships and correlationships, right? And as I continued to read and study and inquire through the years, I realized that the story of American history is not as straightforward as a lot of the agendas, a lot of the competing narratives suggest. It's not black and white. There are stories that the New Left told that were true, but they weren't the whole truth. They weren't the whole story. The 1619 Project has some factual basis to it, but it's not the whole story. Neither is the 1776 Project, even though it also gets a lot of the story correct. Now, for me, as a Bible-believing Christian, there's a difference between the story of America and the story of the Bible. Now, that seems obvious. Seems like a no-duh statement at first. But there are a lot of Christian Americans out there who miss this point, I think. We believe that American history, if it's the story of a Christian nation, it has to be a clean history. Sure, there were excesses, but the story of America as a Christian nation means at the end of the day, the story is actually a good one, about good guys, right? But that's not what the real facts of history show. And to be blunt and frank, that's not what the Bible actually says when it comes to this true story of nations. In the book of Romans, when describing the efforts of human-based righteousness, the Apostle Paul, he writes, this is in Romans chapter 3, verses 10 to 12, "As it is written, there is none righteous, no, not one. There is none who understands, there is none who seeks after God. They have all turned aside, they have altogether become unprofitable. There is none who does good, no, not one." Now, he's quoting from the book of Psalms right there, by the way. Do you think he's only talking about individuals, though? Of course not. What's true of the individual in that verse is true of the nation. It scales all the way up. In fact, if you look at the actual context of that verse in the book of Romans, he's talking about collective groups, or what we would call nations today, a concept which didn't fully exist at the time of Paul's writing in Romans. Now, Jesus in Matthew 25, he clarified a difference between good and wicked nations. He called them sheep and goat nations, and their distinction is based upon how God judges them. But if you look at what he's talking about there, it's quite different from what many of us have learned or been taught when it comes to America being a Christian nation. In fact, when you look at that passage, it might be a little disturbing for some people. The famous verses that most of us probably know, the famous verses about visiting the prisoner, feeding the hungry, being kind to the stranger, or immigrants as we call them today, helping the poor. Jesus said, "Whatever you did to the least of these, you did to him." He's talking about nations in that whole passage. That whole thing right there in Matthew 25 is Jesus talking about nations. And this is the basis for a good or bad nation in Christ's eyes. It's not about their creeds. It's not about their proud histories. It's not about it's not about their good intentions, not about their ideals or values even. It's about how they treat the weak in society, according to Matthew 25. So that kind of changes the story about whether America is a Christian nation or not, at least according to what the Bible says. Now, the history of a nation doesn't fit the comfortable shapes of most agendas, especially a nation as big, as diverse as America is. That's why you can find a little bit of truth in all the different narratives, but not the whole truth. So the fact is, even this series can't present the whole truth. Obviously, I admit I'm biased, but I am looking for the truth. And ultimately, that's what this podcast series is going to do. I want to explore the facts of the story. I'm not anti and I'm not pro-American. I just want to get to the facts and see what they say for themselves. The founding of America, it was a pretty remarkable thing. And I honestly think the hand of God was definitely involved at a lot of points in the story. But so is the hand of man. And there are many proud moments in American history. There are also a lot of moments of great shame, and we don't like to face up to those moments. I want to explore them. I want to explore those moments from the origins to the present. And that's what this series is going to do. We're going to travel through the story of the American Empire, the story of its origins, its ascent, its good days and its bad days. How did we get here? And I want to enjoy the journey of discovery as we go through these episodes. For all the outrage, for all the polarization that's out there in our politics and our society today, these things have existed all along the way. Sometimes in mere seed form, sometimes in full fruition. The principle of Scripture, of a biblical-based worldview, is that you reap what you sow. The fruit we are reaping today was sown in seed form well before we got to this moment. And I want to show you in this series that you can find a lot of the expressions, a lot of the extremes of our present moment in the era of Thomas Jefferson, of Andrew Jackson, of many others. As the old saying goes, history doesn't repeat itself. I think it was Mark Twain who said this. History doesn't repeat itself, but it does echo. There are a lot of historical echoes in our present moment. And we're going to go look for them in the story of the American Empire. And it is an empire, by the way. Anyone who doesn't recognize that doesn't recognize the scope and power of this nation today. That's why this story matters not only to Americans, but to those around the world. And that's why it's important to understand how we got here. And of course, in this process, part of the fun of exploring history is getting beyond the myths. All nations have their own mythology, by the way. I find that with Thomas Jefferson, for example, as regarded and esteemed as he is today, the more I learn about him, to be honest, the less I like him. The myth of Jefferson was built deliberately, and behind that myth is a really pretty dark story. And I definitely want to go check that out. And in the course of this series, we're going to go get behind a lot of the myths. We're going to go and explore the facts. I'm also interested in the idea of America. The whole concept of the American experiment was understood and embraced very early in our history. I love the story of ideas, the merging of philosophy with history. This is where the role of human beings and civilization, the convergence of the complexity of the human soul with the dynamics of our harsh reality of power, force, and ruthlessness really come into play. There are good intentions, and then there are real-world dynamics, right? The story of America, as much, maybe more, than any other nation, is largely the story of ideas, and I want to dive into that story during this series. Ultimately, through this series, I want to explore the story of America's history, not merely from the perspective of one ideology over another or one agenda over another. That's not the way we learn from history. We have to explore the mistakes of the past if we're to learn from the past. That's what I want to do. I want to explore the story. I want to find the story of America's history that my own grandchildren can understand and learn from, if possible. So it's not all rainbows and butterflies, patriotic slogans, and the national anthem, but it's also not going to be all gotcha and outrage as we go through these episodes. What can we learn from the story of the American Empire, its origins, its rise, and the reality of where we are today? So this is where we're going in this series. These episodes will release weekly for the next several months until the whole series is done. The final episode has not been recorded yet, so I don't know how many episodes this is going to be, but I will say it will probably be the longest series we've ever done here at the End of History. Most of the episodes will be available on our public feed through Spotify or wherever you download and stream your favorite podcast. Occasionally, for the sake of time, I'll cut an episode into multiple parts. And in those instances, the different parts of that episode after the first part will be available exclusively to our Patreon subscribers and supporters. So if you haven't signed up yet, for as little as $1 a month, you can become a Patreon supporter and an End of History Insider. That gives you access to a lot of our previous series, podcast series, by the way, which you can check out at theendofhistory.net and jbshreve.com. Also, when you sign up as an End of History Insider, just go to our website, learn how to do that. But when you sign up for that, watch for an email from me. There's a link in that email to a special insiders group where we look at daily and current events. That's available to you as a Patreon insider to the End of History. I think that should do it. Let's go ahead and jump into this series. I'm pretty stoked for this. The first episode should be available right now in your podcast feed. Go ahead, turn it on, and let's start the journey, the story of the American Empire. Thanks for listening, everybody. I'm JB Shreve.
The End of History with JB Shreve. Check out more episodes at iTunes and wherever you download quality podcasts. Join us online at theendofhistory.net for articles and essays from the end of history. Follow JB on Twitter at JB_Shreve. The End of History is produced by Windmill Media.